My blood is thicker than water, my mother used to say. Family means love, no matter what. If she were alive today and saw me sitting here, alone at a bus stop on NA 82nd Avenue in Portland, with nothing but a tote bag full of old receipts and a spare pair of socks, I think she'd sit down beside me and cry. I'm 76, and just a few hours ago I was told by my own son, the same boy I once rocked to sleep through feverish nights, "Mom, you're not contributing anymore. Maybe it's time you found another place." He said it with a calmness that chilled me deeper than the November air. My daughter-in-law stood by the kitchen island, arms crossed, not saying a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was her agreement. The house? That 2-story in Happy Valley. I moved in when they bought it 20 years ago. Back then, they were newly married, strapped with a mortgage they could barely carry. My husband had just passed, and I thought I'd be helpful. I offered to help cover the payments. Not once or twice, but monthly. Year after year. 2 decades. Almost without fail. But there's no plaque for that kind of love. No name on the mailbox. And apparently, no gratitude either. I didn't argue, didn't beg to stay. Instead, I walked into the guest room, the one they never let me decorate, picked up my tote bag, and pulled out something I hadn't looked at in years. A manila folder, soft at the edges, tied with an old piece of ribbon. Inside, 2 decades of mortgage payment receipts, and clipped between them. A faded, notarized letter from my late husband, dated March 2001, assigning me an unspoken share of any property I helped maintain. "She paid with her hands," he wrote. "That ought to be worth something." I'd kept all of that for years, not because I thought I'd need it, but because deep down, I never quite believed I was truly welcome. I used to think that love was enough, that showing up, cooking meals, folding laundry, watching grandkids, those things meant I belonged. But some debts, it seems, can never be paid in full, especially when the people you love decide you're no longer worth the space you take. So here I sit, waiting for a bus, holding proof of a life quietly given to others, and perhaps the start of a new chapter I never expected. If anything in this story touches your heart, please leave a comment below. Sometimes a single kind word can help someone feel seen. The quiet before the storm. It was the fall of 1998. That's when everything changed. Harold, my husband of 41 years, collapsed in the backyard while raking leaves. One moment, I was inside baking his favorite apple cobbler, and the next, a neighbor was pounding on my screen door, yelling my name. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. A sudden stroke, they said. Quick and unforgiving. He left behind our small house in Gresham, a modest pension, and that kind of quiet that follows you into every room, the kind that hums at the edges of everything, reminding you of what's no longer there. At the time, our son, David, had just bought a new house in Happy Valley with his wife, Marlene. A sleek, cream-colored 2-story with an oversized garage and more space than they knew what to do with. They were struggling with the mortgage. Too proud to admit it, but I could see it in David's eyes every time we spoke. That quiet anxiety, the way he hesitated too long when I asked if they were managing. A few weeks after Harold's funeral, David called. "Mom, why don't you come stay with us? It'll be easier, and you won't have to be all alone." I hesitated. My house still smelled of Harold's cologne, his jacket still hung behind the door, but deep down I knew I couldn't afford to keep the house, not on a widow's pension. I also knew David and Marlene needed help, not just financially, but with their first child on the way. So I moved in, I sold the house in Gresham, quietly paid off a small debt Harold had left, and began contributing to their mortgage. At first it was just a few $100s here and there, then every month like clockwork. I also started working again, baking muffins and honey biscuits for the Saturday farmers market before dawn. I'd be up by 4:01 a.m., flour on my sleeves, humming old Patsy Cline songs in the kitchen before the sun rose. It wasn't much, but I funneled every dollar I could into that house. I remember one winter morning in 2002. My hands were raw from scrubbing the floors, the heating barely working. Marlene handed me a cup of tea and said, "We don't say it enough, but we really appreciate you, Mom." It warmed more than just my fingers. In those early years, I believed what they told me. I believed that love was a kind of contract, that what I gave would one day be returned. I believed, above all else, that I was home. "You'll always have a place here, Mom. This is your home, too." David had said it the first week I moved in. He stood in the doorway of the nursery. They were preparing, paint on his jeans, holding a baby monitor still in its box. I remember smiling, feeling something akin to peace. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Every month I handed over my portion of the mortgage without being asked. I kept the receipts just in case, though I never imagined I'd need them. It wasn't about obligation. It was how I showed love. I grew up in a family where your worth was measured by how much you did for others, and I was proud of what I did. For years, that became my rhythm. Up before dawn for breakfast, laundry on Mondays, floors on Wednesdays, gardening on Saturdays. I clipped coupons, watched for sales, bought generic brands. If I saw a dented can at the store, I picked it. 20 cents cheaper meant something. And on nights Marlene worked late and David had to put the kids to bed, I made sure the house was quiet, warm, and steady. I'd light a lavender candle in the hallway, just like my mother used to do when she wanted the family to feel calm. There were times I fell ill, nothing serious, just the aches and chills that come with age. But I'd put on an extra sweater, take an aspirin, and keep working. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want David or Marlene to think I was slowing down, or worse, becoming one more thing to manage. I once overheard Marlene on the phone with her sister. "She's good to have around, but sometimes I just want the house to be mine, you know?" It stung, but I told myself it was just a moment of frustration, that everyone needed their space sometimes. The tricky thing about giving all you have, you never feel like it's enough if the people receiving stop noticing. You start to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, their love was conditional all along. Still, I carried on, because I believed this was my home, because I believed them. Fading from fixture to forgotten, by 2015, the house had changed, not structurally, so then it was still the same old cream walls, still the same creaky back stairs, but the air had shifted. Fewer thank yous, fewer good mornings. I started noticing how conversations happened around me, not with me, how they'd plan dinners without consulting me, or how I'd hear about a family trip only after they'd returned. They weren't cruel, just distant. Like I had faded from being a person into being a fixture, the same way you stop noticing a lamp that's always been in the corner. The only person who seemed to truly see me was Mildred, the next-door neighbor. She was 82 then, and sharp as a tack, a former teacher. Lived alone since her husband passed in 97. Every Thursday, she'd invite me over for chamomile tea and ginger snaps. We'd sit by her bay window looking out at her roses. One afternoon, after I mentioned that David and Marlene had gone to the coast for the weekend without telling me, she frowned. "Sweetie, I've noticed a thing," she said softly. "They don't include you much anymore, do they?" I brushed it off, even chuckled. But Mildred didn't laugh. "You deserve more than to be tolerated in your own home." That word, tolerated, hit me harder than I let on. It echoed in me for days. Around that time, Marlene started redecorating. She repainted the lavender hallway I'd grown to love, saying it felt too dated. She boxed up a ceramic angel figurine Harold had given me and put it in the garage without asking. When I went looking for it, she simply said, "It doesn't fit the new aesthetic." I started spending more time in my room. I didn't want to be in the way. But even in that small space, I could feel myself shrinking. My world, once full of meaning and movement, had narrowed to just 4 walls and a twin bed. Still, I told no one, not even Mildred, because saying it out loud would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The breaking point. In January 2023, I officially retired. My hands were starting to ache too much for baking, and my back protested every time I bent to pull trays from the oven. I had saved modestly, but not enough to live comfortably on my own. Still, I felt a sense of relief. I had spent so much of my life giving to others. Maybe now I could rest. But almost as soon as I stopped working, something shifted in the air at home. Marlene started making comments. At first, they were veiled, little digs wrapped in a smile. "Mom, now that you're not working, maybe you'd enjoy a change of scenery. It must be boring being home all day. Maybe it's time you found a place where you have more freedom." I ignored it. I thought she was just adjusting to the new dynamic. But then David started joining in. One evening, as we were clearing dishes, he said, "You know, Mom, the kids are growing up. We're thinking of turning your room into an office or maybe a music room for Sarah." I stared at him. It was the first time he'd called it your room, not your part of the house or your space. Just a room, like a spare closet. Then came Easter. I'd spent the whole weekend preparing deviled eggs, smoked ham, lemon meringue pie with fresh zest. I brought out the good china, the set we only used for holidays. Everyone ate, complimented the food. Sarah even kissed my cheek. And then, after dessert, David cleared his throat. "Mom," he began, not making eye contact, "we've been talking, and we think maybe it's time you looked into senior housing. You're not contributing financially anymore, and it's been, hard." Marlene looked down at her lap. The room went silent. Even Sarah, barely 12, seemed to sense something was wrong. She fidgeted with her fork. I didn't speak. I couldn't. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of me. They gave me 2 weeks to find another place. 2 weeks. After 20 years. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my small room, the same room where I'd folded laundry, bandaged scraped knees, whispered lullabies, and stared at the walls. There was a dent near the dresser from when Sarah threw a rubber ball too hard, a faded crayon mark from when we built a blanket fort and she insisted on drawing stars on the wall. I never had the heart to paint over it. None of it seemed to matter anymore. I opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, the one they never touched. Inside was the manila folder, the one I'd carried from house to house, from job to job. Inside, 2 decades of mortgage payments, and with my handwriting scribbled in the memo line, and beneath them that old notarized letter from Harold, written in his neat, careful script. For her share, paid not just in money, but in devotion. I traced my finger over the ink. I hadn't looked at that letter in years. I'd almost forgotten I had it. Part of me wanted to wave it in David's face, to scream, "Look, I belong here." But I didn't, because something deeper had shifted. Not just the loss of a room, but the breaking of a bond I thought was unshakable. The next morning, I made coffee as usual, set the table, folded a load of laundry still in the dryer. No one said a word. David kissed his wife goodbye and left for work. Marlene scrolled her phone at the kitchen island. Sarah came downstairs in her school uniform, saw me, and gave a small wave. "Grandma, are you okay?" I nodded. But inside, something had gone still, like the quiet right before a storm. I knew then. I couldn't stay. Not just because they didn't want me, but because I finally stopped pretending I was wanted. I didn't sleep the night they gave me the envelope. I lay in bed, though calling it bed felt generous. It was a single mattress sagging in the middle, the same one I'd brought from the old house. The only thing I hadn't left behind. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the ticking of the hallway clock, each second like a small hammer tapping at my chest. Around 2 a.m. I got up and turned on the light. The bulb flickered. One I'd just changed last month. The high window curtain rod had once been loose, and I'd climbed on a little stool to tighten the screws myself. The chair in the corner had a leg I'd fixed after Sarah broke it during a game of musical chairs. I looked around the room, truly looked, at all the small ways my hands had shaped it over the years. I'd hemmed the curtains, repainted the baseboards, cleaned out the vents every spring, replaced the weather stripping on the window, hung pictures of Sarah in her Halloween costumes, a bee, a princess, a baby elephant. I'd poured myself into this room. And yet, now, you're not contributing anymore. We found a place you can afford. You should move out. The words echoed louder than the silence around me. I whispered aloud, to no one. So this is what it feels like to be a tenant without a lease? A guest in a home you helped pay for? I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed my palms into my knees. They ached. Everything ached. Not just from age, but from something deeper. From the realization that years of loyalty, sacrifice, and care could be brushed aside like dust on a shelf. I wanted to cry, but even my tears felt tired. Instead, I just sat there, breathing shallowly, watching the darkness shift into dawn. Some part of me had broken that night, but another part, a quieter, older part, had just begun to wake up. Taking back what's mine. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my lap, palms open as if they were waiting to hold something that would never arrive. In my mind, I replayed Marlene's voice, each word like a tiny needle. She's stopped contributing. We really need the space. Were we supposed to carry her forever? She said it with the ease of someone talking about old furniture, not a human being, not the woman who babysat her kids so she could finish nursing school, not the one who stayed up nights with Sarah when she had a fever and couldn't stop crying, not the person who made bone broth when Marlene had the flu, or who sat quietly in the pew while they renewed their vows, pretending she hadn't been left off the family slideshow. It wasn't just the words that hurt. It was what they revealed. They had stopped seeing me as family long ago. That night, I stood in the hallway outside the laundry room, where our family portrait still hung. David was holding baby Sarah, Marlene glowing in a soft blue dress, and there I was, off to the side, one hand on a stroller. I remember how happy I'd been that day. I wore my best blouse. I'd brought lemon bars for the shoot. Looking at it now, I realized I was always slightly out of frame, not because they forgot, but because I'd made it easy to be left there. I had loved quietly, worked quietly, given quietly, and in return, I had quietly become dispensable. Still, even in that moment, I didn't get angry or slam doors. I simply turned off the hall light and went back to my room, because sometimes silence speaks all the words they refuse to hear. July 20th, my 76th birthday. I woke up before dawn, as I had every year since Harold passed, and quietly went into the kitchen. The morning light was weak and soft, casting long shadows on the tile. I tied my apron, the one with the little strawberries embroidered near the hem, and started peeling carrots. Baking my own birthday cake had become a tradition. Carrot cake, Harold's favorite, with thick cream cheese frosting and a hint of toasted pecans. I had made it every year, not because anyone asked me to, but because it was my way of marking time, of proving, to myself more than anyone, that I was still here. When the cake cooled on the wire rack, I spread a clean tablecloth, set out the sugar bowl and 2 mugs, just in case someone joined me. I even found a small candle in a drawer, left over from Sarah's 5th birthday, and then a pink 6 I turned upside down, but the house was silent. No footsteps, no voices, no happy birthday, Mom. By noon, I realized no one remembered. Sarah was at summer camp that week. David left for work early without a word. Marlene walked through the kitchen once, glanced at the cake, and said nothing. I watched her pour her coffee and scroll her phone, then disappear into the back room. Around 2 p.m., I went back to my room. A plain white envelope had been slipped under the door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed from an online listing, an address circled in red. A note at the bottom read, "We found a suitable place. It's affordable and close to the bus stop. You can move in next week." That was it. No happy birthday. No card. No hug. That evening, David poked his head into the doorway. "Sorry, Mom, we couldn't do anything today. We were just too busy." "Another time?" I nodded. But in that moment, something inside me, The last thread I'd been holding on to quietly snapped. The next morning, I woke up early, not out of habit, but out of resolve. The cake was still on the counter, untouched. I didn't bother covering it. Let it grow stale, I thought, like everything else they had forgotten. I went to my room and pulled the manila folder from its hiding place under the bed. It smelled faintly of paper and time. I laid everything out on the table with deliberate care, like a ritual. The proof of a life in ink and notary stamps. There were check receipts, each with my signature, with mortgage scribbled in the memo line. I had never missed a month. Some were faded, others crisp. Together they formed a quiet chronology of sacrifice. Then there was the faded letter, notarized in March 2001. Harold's signature was firm, unwavering. The document stated that any property I helped pay for, in the event of his passing, would be considered partly mine. A clause he'd insisted on including, knowing I would never ask for recognition unless offered. My hands didn't shake. Not anymore. I placed everything in a plastic file folder, zipped it shut, and tucked it into my tote bag, the same one I use for grocery shopping and library books. I caught the 10:15 a.m. bus downtown. The ride was quiet, only a few passengers. The city slid by like a silent movie. I got off at SW 6th and crossed the street to a brick building with ivy climbing its sides. The office hadn't changed much since Harold brought me here for taxes. Thomas Miller still practiced there. Older now, his step slower, but his handshake was still firm. He blinked when he saw me. "Well, if it isn't the strongest woman I know," he said, with a tired smile. I didn't return the smile. "Tom," I said softly, placing the folder on his desk, "I need your help." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally doing something for myself. Thomas Miller read through each page slowly, adjusting his reading glasses as he went. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and rapped his knuckles on the folder. "You have a case," he said. "A strong one." I said nothing, just nodded. He explained it in calm, measured terms. My consistent financial contributions, the letter from Harold, and the nature of the informal arrangement, though not written into the title, created what the law called equitable interest. And in Oregon, equitable interest was real, recognized, defensible. We filed the petition quietly. No lawyers banging tables, no scandalous headlines. Just a 68-page submission to the Multnomah County Court, requesting a legal review of my contributions and an injunction to freeze the property from being sold or transferred until judgment. A month passed. Then one morning, as I was watering Mildred's roses while she recovered from hip surgery, David pulled into the driveway. I could see the envelope in his hand before he got out of the car. He walked straight up to me. No hello, no smile. "What is this?" he asked, holding out the papers to me. His voice was tight, as if trying to hold back panic. I wiped my hands on my gardening apron and looked at the envelope. "You've been served," I said softly. "You're suing us?" His eyes widened. "You're going to sue your own family?" I looked at him, truly looked. The boy I'd held in my arms after Harold's funeral. The man who now stood before me, failing to recognize the woman who had kept his world from falling apart. "No, David," I said. "I'm not suing my family." I let the silence settle before adding, "But if I'm not family, then I suppose I'll have to act like a stranger." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The court date was set for the second week of September. A modest courtroom, pale gray walls, and worn benches. Marlene sat stiffly beside David, arms crossed. I didn't look at them. I focused on my lawyer and the documents we had painstakingly prepared. When the judge entered, a middle-aged woman with silver hair and tired eyes, she asked me only 2 questions. "Do you have proof of contribution?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you believe your contributions were made with the understanding you would remain in that home?" "Yes, I do." Thomas presented the check receipts, the notarized letter, and, most critically, a photo from 2003, showing me handing an envelope to David in front of the house. It had been taken by Sarah, who was playing with a disposable camera. She hadn't known she was capturing evidence. Marlene tried to speak about how I never asked for recognition, about how they thought I was just helping, not investing. But the judge held up a hand. Intent does not supersede documentation, she said clearly. 2 days later, the decision came in writing. I was declared owner of 49% equitable interest in the property. The court ordered a forced sale of the house, with proceeds to be divided accordingly. David didn't show up when the real estate agent came to take photos. When the house was listed, I walked through it one last time. I touched the banister I'd polished every Sunday, the hallway where Sarah took her first steps. I took only my own things. And the old strawberry apron. Everything else could stay. A few weeks later, the house sold. I didn't cry. Because this time, I wasn't losing something. I was reclaiming it. New beginnings. The check cleared 2 weeks after the house was sold. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough for a modest one-bedroom house on the edge of Salem with a white picket fence, a worn porch swing, and a kitchen just big enough for what I planned. It was the kind of place where silence felt like peace, not punishment. I planted herbs by the window, rosemary, basil, and thyme. And for the first time in decades, I cooked for no one but myself. I played Patsy Cline on an old radio. I sewed new curtains, and this time I chose the fabric just for me. That December, I opened the doors to Warm Plate, a small volunteer-run soup kitchen nestled beside a local church. Every Thursday, we serve hot lunches, meatloaf, chicken stew, cornbread, meals that feel like someone still remembers your name. Most of our guests were people like me, quiet souls who had given too much for too long and found themselves forgotten in the noise of younger lives. We greeted each one by name. And before every meal, I would say, "You are welcome here." Not because of what you've done, but simply because you are. Above the serving counter in a plain wooden frame hung a single piece of paper. It was the first mortgage receipt I ever paid, February 2001. The one with my handwriting in shaky ink. Payment. For the house, for them, for us. That receipt, once dismissed by Marlene as just old junk, had become my anchor. Never underestimate what others quietly do for you. Sometimes I still think about that house in Happy Valley. About David. About Sarah. I wonder if she ever asks where I went. I wonder if one day she'll stumble into this little kitchen and recognize my carrot cake, but I no longer live in that ache. I used to believe that sitting at a family dinner meant you were part of something, that showing up, helping, giving, those things made you belong. But I've learned being present at the table doesn't make you family. It's how they treat you when you have nothing left to give. That tells you everything. If someone you know has ever been made to feel small, unwanted, or invisible, please send them this story. A video may be short, but it can carry a weight someone else forgot they had the strength to put down.